So we'll be starting, and welcome to Pushkin House and to the Pushkin Club. We are delighted to welcome you here, but also two wonderful translators from Polish, Antonia, Lloyd-Jones, and Alissa, Valles. We will be talking about Czapski, Józef Czapski today, because, well, they both translated different works of him, but these are not the only works that they translated from Polish. Antonia is well known for translating Olga Tokarczuk. Alissa is well known for translating Zbigniew Herbert, and Richard, you have to... Krynicki. Now, I'll try to say a few words in Polish as well, just to say that Alissa translated Wspomnienia Starobielskie, and Antonia zapomniałam, nieludzkie ziemie. Now, I will say just a few words because I think that apart from being one of the very few survivors of Katyń massacres, Józef Czapski was also probably a unique person who in the 20th century knew both Akhmatova, a Russian poet, and Orwell, George Orwell. And as someone who has been studying Orwell, I just want to read a little bit before we properly come to Czapski. I just want to read a little bit from Orwell's letter about Czapski, because he and Arthur Koestler, the author of Darkness at Noon, were both trying in March 1946 to publish Wspomnienia Starobielskie, which have already been translated into Italian and French, but not English. And Orwell wrote on the 5th of March 1946, "Dear Arthur, it's funny you should send me Czapski's pamphlet, which I have been trying for some time to get someone to translate and publish. Warburg wouldn't do it because he said it was an awkward length. And latterly, I gave it to the anarchist Freedom Press group. I didn't know what decision they've come to. I met Czapski in Paris and had lunch with him. There is no doubt that he is not only authentic, but a rather exceptional person, though whether he is any good as a painter, I don't know." So that's typical Orwellian honesty. And there was an episode when actually Czapski influenced one word in the Animal Farm. So if we come to that, I'll tell you which. But now, I would like to start with Antonia, who will give us a brief outline of Czapski's life.
Józef Czapski. Thank you. Yes. Right. That's very helpful. Thank you. So Józef Czapski, some of you have probably heard me blathering about him before at the Ognisko. So I thought that for those who know all this and who will think, this woman's telling me things I know, I brought along an album of Czapski's paintings, which was produced by Eric Karpeles. So while I'm talking, perhaps you'd like to pass this around and have a look at it. Ursula can start, because she definitely knows everything I'm going to say already and probably more. So, oops, yes, you're doing that for me. Okay, so I'd just like to start by telling you he was primarily a painter as well as a writer, and most of his writing included critical essays about art and literature, some of which Alissa has now translated. He also wrote illustrated diaries, copious diaries, and he also was kind of by default a soldier, though a very unwilling one, a diplomat, a highly cultivated intellectual, and an aristocrat with very progressive ideas. And somehow, there's something about this man that makes him the continuing object of fascination and admiration. And I find that everybody who comes across him somehow falls under his charm. He has an absolutely magnetic quality. His life spanned most of the 20th century, and he had this exceptional personality that made him very open to the world around him and the people in it. And he had an incredible talent for communicating and for observing, and then for recording his experiences, either in words or in pictures. And that makes him one of the very best witnesses to his times. And Eric Karpeles, who's a painter who lives in California, doesn't speak any Polish, has written a new biography of Czapski, which you can get a copy of downstairs. And he never met Czapski, but when he read Czapski's lectures on Proust, which were written in a prison camp, which is not where most people write lectures on Proust, this American artist just totally fell in love with Czapski and everything about him, and devoted several years to researching his life and writing this wonderful biography. And I just wanted to start with a quote from it. Józef Czapski lived many lives in his 96 years as soldier, public figure, historical witness, memoirist, essayist, painter. His most dominant physical trait was similarly expansive. He stood over 6 feet 6 inches tall. Attaining such an unwieldy stature early on, he had had to master the tall person's delicate navigation of spatial relations in a world built for shorter people. Then there's there's a lovely thing, somebody describing him looking like an ostrich wandering about. So, like an elongated striding man by Giacometti, he had a tendency to lean into space. An animated talker, fluent in 4 languages, he makes a fascinating subject to observe speaking on film. He liked to talk, and he liked to argue a point, to stir up passionate dialogue. He was consumed by an urgent need to communicate. So, he was born in 1896, and he was one of 7 children born to a very well-connected aristocratic family descended from several of Europe's noble houses. But right from the start, he was totally uninterested in being Count Hutten Czapski. And despite the traditions of their class, he and his brothers and sisters had very different ideas, kind of progressive and socialist. And to their father's utter dismay, they tried to educate and entertain all the local peasants. And his grandmother was frightfully worried that this would reduce their deference to the master and that they wouldn't greet her politely anymore because they got ideas above their station. So then Czapski and his brother were sent to St. Petersburg to learn Russian properly and then to go to law school. But the First World War erupted while they were there during his first year as a law student. And because their father was worried that they'd get put in the army, he enrolled them in a prestigious military academy because that way they'd have to do training and they wouldn't get sent straight to the front. But about a month later, he witnessed the violence of the February Revolution, and when striking workers were suppressed in the streets. And he was sent out on his first combat duty against Bolshevik forces, and he was utterly horrified by all of this. So, operating under the active influence of Tolstoyan pacifism, Tolstoy was a very important influence for him. He told his commanding officer that he was incapable of discharging a gun to kill another man. And he assumed he'd face court-martial and probably be shot as a deserter for doing this. And he claimed he was ready to sacrifice himself on behalf of his anti-militaristic beliefs. And the commander listened to this young soldier's dramatic outburst and then, quite remarkably, told him that he was quite sure Czapski's convictions and intentions were pure. When I was young, he reassured the 21-year-old cadet Czapski, I also wanted to change the world. Go on then, try. So from 1921 to 32, he was mostly in Paris. The picture on the left shows the Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow in about 1921. You can see Czapski towering over everyone else as usual. And in 1924, he went off with a group of 11 other young painters on a 6-week field trip to Paris, which lasted for 7 years. And when he was in Paris, he met all sorts of artists and writers who had become world famous, like Giacometti, and Nabokov was somebody he knew. There's another Russian writer he was pals with. And he moved in all the most groundbreaking artistic circles, hanging around with Picasso and Bonnard and people like that. So he had a great time. But when he was 30, in 1926, he fell very seriously ill with typhoid. And he spent his convalescence reading Proust in great detail, as you would, wouldn't you? So that's how he knew Proust backwards. And then he went back to Poland, and he spent most of the 1930s in Warsaw. There's a painting from that period, from 1933. It's called In the Park. So you can see it's the kind of similar to those French painters. So then, this is where the kind of most dramatic stuff starts. When Germany attacked Poland, Czapski was told to go and report to his cavalry regiment. And of course, you know, he was a certain age by then. He was early 40s. And he was in combat near Lvov, where the Poles were forced to surrender to the Soviets, and he was taken prisoner. And as you probably know, the Polish prisoners of war were subjected to terrible journeys, awful humiliation and starvation. And then they were crammed into very primitive prisoner of war camps where they suffered from severe malnutrition, and they were all covered in lice and had horrible diseases. And in these circumstances, they found refuge in literature, and they shared, all the soldiers shared the books they happened to have with them and read them all till they fell apart. And Czapski said, "I don't think I ever read with such attention." And that was where he gave the lectures on Proust, based purely on his memory of Proust. And there's a diagram there which shows him writing out all the connections of the characters in Proust. And he did drawings of his fellow prisoners. And of course, eventually in early 1940, almost all of these Polish officers were transported to their death in Katyń forests and other such execution sites. But Czapski was just one of 78 prisoners at the Starobil'sk camp, and Elissa's going to tell us more about that, which had housed 4,000 people. He was one of the few who was sent off to another camp at Gryazovets, and they never knew why they were singled out, why they weren't killed. But he miraculously survived. So then, when Germany attacked Russia, the Poles managed to persuade Stalin to let them create an army within the Soviet Union. So all these raggle-taggle Poles who'd been exiled to all sorts of remote parts of the Soviet Union, Siberia, Central Asia, and so on, and the prisoners of war, were all allowed to go and join this new army, which entailed very difficult, dangerous journeys in a terrible Russian winter. These people were in rags, half-starved. A lot of them died on the way. It was the most dreadful thing. And Czapski made this perilous journey himself, and then his job within the army was to receive the new arrivals and gather information from them about the possible location of all those missing Polish officers. Because, you know, the elite of their army, nobody knew where they were. And so this Anders army, it came to be known, assembled at a place called Totskoye, which is near Rostov-on-Don in south-central Russia. And this is General Anders, who was in charge of that army. And there's Sikorsky and Anders meeting Stalin. And this is an open-air mass at the camp at Totskoye, or Totsk. There's different ways of naming it. So the book Inhuman Land, which I translated, which we can tell you more about later, it's based on the diaries he wrote in this part of his life, and it's an incredible eyewitness catalogue of every aspect of the Polish exile and imprisonment in the Soviet Union, because he gathered all the stories from the people who'd ended up there. And there's a lot of anecdotes about the people he met and the things that had happened to them in various different circumstances. And there's also a lot of reflections on art and literature, a great deal about Polish poetry and Russian literature as well. And it also describes how the army assembled and what a terrible state they were in, all the illnesses they had. And you can see here, these are children, because there were Polish, whole families were sent off to Siberia. There are children terribly emaciated on their arrival at this camp. Czapski himself was very ill after arriving, and of course not everyone survived. And you can see they were very under-equipped, so they had tents just pitched in the snow. It was pretty grim. So then Czapski was given this task of looking for all these missing officers, and he went all the way to Moscow, where he tried to meet up with some of the top Soviet ministers. And he describes all these unsatisfactory encounters with some very, very sinister people indeed. And what they knew, but he didn't, was that everyone had been killed. It's fascinating, the description of wartime Russia that he provides. And here you can see the Lubyanka prison, where he describes what happened to people who were imprisoned in there, in the horrible death cells. And then this is the man who was the head of the Gulag, who was called General Nasedkin. Czapski went to see him, and what's striking about his encounter with him is compared with all the descriptions of the emaciated, sickly Poles. This man was rather plump. You can see he looks quite well fed. And he was sort of drinking alcohol and eating chocolates and things. And it's just quite shocking reading this contrast in the book between this smug bastard and the poor old Poles. So then Czapski also, his mission took him to Kuibyshev, which is now Samara in southern Russia, and the Poles had a diplomatic mission there. And while he was there, he met some major cultural figures. On the right, you have the Soviet novelist Alexei Tolstoy, and through Alexei Tolstoy, he met Anna Akhmatova, and they made a very strong impression on each other. We're going to read you some about that, some extracts about that. So then the army travelled through Iran and Iraq and the Middle East and ended up eventually fighting on the Italian front at Monte Casino. And the Poles were determined still to do their bit in the war and have a go at the Germans, although they were so in such a poor state. And there's a map, which is in this copy of the Inhuman Land, showing the route that the army travelled on a very long, complicated journey. There's a picture of Czapski in Egypt on the way, and also in Beirut, and his diaries and his memoirs, which are full of drawings, the diaries, they describe all of this journey. And then there's a picture from Monte Casino of soldiers scrambling up a dreadful steep incline. And in Inhuman Land, he describes what the army did at Monte Casino, which was terrible fighting. Anyone who knows anything about Monte Casino knows that there were lots of different divisions from different armies from all over the world, and that it was extremely difficult fighting and a critical moment in the war because it allowed the British to break through and beat the Italians. So I just added this because Czapski also writes about the Warsaw Uprising, where his sister spent the whole of the war in Warsaw, and she wrote an eyewitness diary, and she was a very important person in his life. You can see it's probably almost, the person is almost as tall as him, which must have been quite hard for a woman. They were very close all their lives, and her diary is fascinating. It's not in this book, unfortunately, but he quotes it, and it shows that she was just as good at bearing witness as he was. And there's an absolutely chilling bit in that diary where she describes coming very close to being shot dead by the Nazis, by some very cynical German soldiers. And just the lack of concern is horrifying. She describes them rounding up this group of people while flinging a helmet for a dog to bring back. And they keep flinging the helmet and the dog trots back with it. It's just, makes my blood run cold.
Has it been translated into English?
Not all of it, no.
Yeah, but bits.
I found it in the Post Library and read all of it. So after the war, Czapski settled in Paris, where he worked very closely with Jerzy Giedroyc, who is the editor-in-chief of Kultura, which was one of the most influential intellectual journals of the 20th century. And Kultura had its own publishing house that published exiled Polish writers throughout the communist era. And Czapski's own essays on art and literature were published in the Kultura Journal, and he raised funds for Kultura in the United States, and he undertook various missions of cultural diplomacy. And on the left you can see, in 1950, Czapski and Giedroyc, and they were representing Poland at the Congress for Cultural Freedom in Berlin, where there were other intellectual giants like Bertrand Russell and Arthur Koestler. And Czapski gave a very impassioned speech about the formation of university in exile. And I wanted to read you this quote, partly because of what Russia's up to now and what we're having to live through now. He said, "Each atom bomb is more expensive to build than a university. Nevertheless, a university consistently led by design and vision might prove far more dangerous for the Soviet regime than a bomb, and would surely be more in line with the precious tradition of free men striving for liberty." Such a beautiful idea. And in 1951, he spoke to a US Congressional Committee about the massacre of the Polish prisoners in the Soviet Union, the prisoners of war, and this committee concluded that the Soviets were accountable and should be brought to trial before a world court, but the Eisenhower administration refused to take any action. So for decades, people were convinced that the Nazis were responsible for the death of all those officers. So then Czapski was always primarily a painter, and he lived very modestly in this little room at Maison Lafitte, the Paris suburb where Kultura is based. And it was his bedroom, his study, and his artist studio. And if you're in Krakow, go to the Czapski Pavilion, which is a museum dedicated to his memory. And there's a fantastic life-size reproduction of that little room. And that was the idea of Andrzej Wajda, the film director, who was his great friend. And only a film director would have that idea of something visual like that. The painting on the right is called Neon and Sink, and it's a self-portrait from 1959. As you can see, you can only see part of him. His paintings are rather odd, as those of you who've been looking at the album will see. And Eric Karpeles, being an artist himself, has written a lot about Czapski's art and his artistic influences. And you'll find all that in the biography that Eric's written, that Czapski knew all sorts of Polish notables and others, like Zbigniew Herbert was a great friend of his, and Simone Weil, and Adam Michnik, the political activist and journalist. And Michnik said a lovely thing about him. He said, "Czapski was one of the greatest people in my life. I am from the school of the rebellious, the same school as Czapski." And when Michnik was jailed by the communist authorities, Czapski's essays and his whole attitude to life were an inspiration and a consolation for Michnik. And I told you earlier a bit about the diaries. I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures from them because they're so glorious, and there are just hundreds of them. So a lot of his pre-war diary notebooks got lost in the war, unfortunately, but he filled another 279 volumes after it. He had these lovely cloth-bound books that he used for his diaries. They have text and watercolor drawings. And the originals are all kept at the Czartoryski Museum in Krakow, but you can buy some of them as reproductions, and they really are just mesmerizing. And I really love these. This is from 1966, and this is from 1970. And you know, nowadays, if you go to a cafe, you're in danger of being photographed by a complete stranger on their iPhone. But once upon a time, if Czapski was around, you risked being drawn and memorialized like this. So. And then there's a couple of his oil paintings here. Stairwell from 1964, and that's called Young Man Before de Staël from 1981. And that's him, aged 89, in his little room in 1985. And his paintings seem strangely insubstantial at first glance. And he was once interviewed by a newspaper reporter who found his subject matter very strange. Lonely people, deserted cafe tables, faces half concealed in the metro, minute daily events glimpsed in passing, they were described as. So seemingly negligible objects, like a bedside table with a single piece of string on it, were cited. And when Czapski was called on to justify these inconsequential presences, he said, "Each time It is almost nothing, but that almost nothing signifies everything. And that's why Eric's biography is called Almost Nothing, which is, there's the biography that Eric wrote, and there's the album, which is being passed around now. So, but we're here also to tell you about these. These are the 3 new translations. Eric translated the lectures on Proust, which were written in French and delivered in the prison camp. And then Inhuman Land, that I told you about, and the Memories of Starobielsk that Alissa has recently translated. And she's going to tell you more about it. So I just want to finish by saying it's completely impossible to summarize Józef Czapski's life in quite such a rapid way. Please forgive me, his ghost. But I'd like to quote Adam Zagajewski, the poet, to finish off, who was another personal friend, and who said of him, "He was a beautiful human being, courageous, noble, but also hard-working, occasionally a soldier, journalist, diarist, always writing, drawing, always with a sketchbook in hand, always ready to help friends and strangers. In his person, high intelligence and remarkable artistic talent met with an active, almost naive goodness, a rather rare combination, as we know." So over to Alissa, who's going to tell you about Czapski's experiences as a prisoner of war in Starobil'sk.
Thank you very much, Antonia. I just wanted to confirm, are all these books published by New York Review of Books publisher or not?
All except the album, which is Thames and Hudson.
Right, I'm passing it over to Alissa, but I just wanted to say one thing, that Orwell and Koestler's efforts failed, and as the Memoirs of Starobielsk were not translated in 1946, nor any time later, till this book, translated by Alissa and published by New York Review of Books, has appeared. So I think, it took some time between 1946 and 2021. Over to you.
Yes, we're still fulfilling the Orwellian mission, aren't we, Masha? So thank you to Pushkin House, to Masha for this occasion, and for Antonia for that dazzling journey through the life, really almost a century-long life of the most extraordinary extremes. Eric Karpeles and Antonia sort of paved the way for the much smaller book that I had the pleasure of assembling for New York Review Books. And Inhuman Land, which is Antonia's work, is considered, I think, by many to be Czapski's masterpiece as a writer. It contains all of the facets of a man who's very hard to grasp, as everyone seems to be saying in their different ways. It's very hard to say what Czapski was, and I think Adam Zagajewski, who introduced me to Czapski, and dedicated, I think, 2 poems to Czapski, felt that he was a particularly important figure for poets, because there was a fullness to his consciousness, which Adam considered to be the essence of poetry. That is, Adam called him a poet in the sense of someone in whom the aesthetic, the ethical, and the metaphysical impulses were constantly being fine-tuned, aligned, sort of contrasted and confronted with each other. And it's that fullness of Czapski's consciousness that comes out in all of his writing, in all the different forms he wrote. I mean, he also wrote wonderful letters. His diaries, unfortunately, to me, are completely illegible, but they are slowly being deciphered by very hardworking Poles. And so I expect in the years to come, there will be more Czapski. But that combination of his artistic and his sort of ethical and historical eye, because he is a very visual writer, is what I wanted to put into this book. So, as Orwell said, Memories of Starobielsk itself is a text of about 50 pages, hard to make a book, and I translated it back in 2004, I think, and actually traveled to Starobil'sk at that time, which is now in the People's Republic of Luhansk, so-called. The convent, which had been there before the revolution, has now been rebuilt. I don't know what its fate will be under the current occupation, but it's a fascinating city in its own right. The text that Czapski wrote that's called Memories of Starobielsk was actually written in the Middle East on the way to Italy, on the circuitous route that you saw on the map there, with the Polish army from the Soviet Union through Iran, Palestine, Egypt, Palestine, back to Europe, and it was written. As opposed to Inhuman Land, it was written before Czapski was aware of the mass graves that had been found. He wrote Memories of Starobielsk, he says, partly as a way of informing the families of the men who had disappeared with whom he had been in the camp there, of their, the place where they had last been seen, to sort of mark for their families back in Poland where they had last been seen, in the hope that they, of course, would be found again. And so this text is very unusual. I mean, it's a camp memoir, but it's also, it's like a portrait gallery, a very intimate portrait gallery of a really interesting cross-section of Polish society. I mean, these were mostly officers. The 4,000 men who were imprisoned at Starobil'sk, they were mostly reserve officers, which meant that they were all, professionals of some kind. There were poets, engineers, scientists, doctors, priests, every possible people from every possible background, all gathered together in those atrocious conditions. And as Antonia was describing, the text describes how they survived, how they helped each other, and also to some degree the dreams that kept their hopes alive. And so when we read it now, it's very moving because the shadow of Katyń hangs over them. But Czapski, when he was writing, was simply writing about his friends. And trying to preserve as much of them as he could, since he hadn't been able to find them. So I added to that short memoir a selection of writings from Czapski over the decades, all the decades, in fact, of his life, which relate to Russia in one way or another. To me, the heart of this book is a group of short essays about painting, which he wrote on a train in 1941, going from Moscow to to the Polish army headquarters, which was then in Tashkent. I guess he was going to Tashkent. And these are, so he describes in his little introduction to them, these were essays that he wrote in the middle of war. They're the most pure reflections on the work of a painter that you can imagine, about the coordination of hand and eye, about analysis versus inspiration, will versus chance in the making of art. And I think they encapsulate something about Czapski, which is one of the things that makes him so fascinating. The fact that he was able to retain, in these most extreme, 20th century, conditions of mass violence and loss, an extraordinary intimacy and warmth of vision, and a sort of self-awareness and a tremendous level of attention, so that this aesthetic artist's eye was a kind of spiritual exercise for him. That is, it's the level of attention that he felt was owed to the other and to the world, and that's something that I tried to reflect in this book. I wanted to read maybe just a page so that his voice can sound for a moment. I think I'm okay, yeah. So this is just from the middle of the memoir, Memories of Starobielsk, which is both a memoir, a set of recollections, and a reflection, as you'll see, on the nature of memory. Very soon after arriving in the camp, I developed a lung infection. With a high fever, spitting blood, I made my way to the sick bay. I had been told, as if in a fairy tale, that there was a bathroom there, that you could have a proper bath. And indeed, I was led to a little room with a bathtub. However, the tub leaked, and in it stood a bowl with barely lukewarm water. That was it. Nevertheless, I was given a clean shirt, and when they put me in a little room with 5 other consumption patients, I felt as if I was virtually in paradise. We were treated by friends, by Polish doctors, and by one young Bolshevik doctor, a caring and intelligent woman whom all the patients remember with gratitude. It sounds odd, but I have to admit that those 3 or 4 weeks I spent in the hospital were almost happy. From the beginning, my high fever gave me a kind of memory euphoria, a constant communion with those I'd left behind in Poland. I drew up an account of my life, which seemed to me already over, and with a heart filled with gratitude and tenderness for my loved ones, of whom I didn't even know then whether they had perished, I lived in a world of cherished memories. Those days were a contradiction of Dante's oft-quoted words, "Nessun maggior dolore che ricordarsi del tempo felice nella miseria." After relentless, intense, nervous days of rough treatment and life in a dense, lice-ridden crowd of despairing men, I could lie there unmoving, in a clean shirt, in a little room where there were 5 of us, not 100. This also had a great effect on my state of, quote, happiness. Then the fever began to fall. My strength came back. I decided to save myself from mental degeneration, and in the evenings when my colleagues were asleep, I attempted to write from memory a history of painting from David to our times. My history, which barely led up to the Fontainebleau School or Courbet, was written in tiny pencil script in a notebook that I later lost in a prison car, somewhere between Starobil'sk and Grzezowiec. But even so, it did me a lot of good because working on it brought many memories back. Intellectual work without books or notes is a completely different experience from work in normal conditions. What Proust, it's okay, normal conditions. What Proust called involuntary memory and considered the one true source of any literary creation acts much more powerfully. After a certain time, facts and details float to the surface that you had no idea were stored up somewhere in the folds of your brain. At the same time, those memories that seem to grow from your subconscious mind are more fused, organically connected, and more personal. I lay there on my narrow bed next to a patient whose fever remained constant at 39 degrees Celsius. He had degenerative consumption in an extremely severe form. He was Major Kłopotowski. He'd fought in the previous war with the Polish forces in Siberia. He knew all of Siberia and had returned to Poland via Japan and India. He'd been awarded the Virtuti Militari in 1920. I've known few people who told me the story of their lives so interestingly and simply. I had the impression that this worn-out man, already so close to death, had an uninhibited need to tell me everything he'd lived through and experienced. The charm of his tale came from the fact that he never added false twists, never made himself out to be a hero, but each detail of that story showed the sensitivity, the scope, the vivid intelligence of the man. Being myself ill at that time, physically exhausted, and having an intense need for solitude rather than conversation, I was unable to listen to his stories all day. I slept a lot, and sometimes I pretended to be asleep for hours just so that I wouldn't have to talk or listen. The major lay in wait for me to wake up. He was upset with me for sleeping so much, and he would immediately begin to tell me more and more episodes from his life. He'd left a wife and little son behind in Poland. I tell you, my son has eyes like precious stones, and when he spoke of his son, you couldn't hold him back anymore. His health was worse and worse. He had no news of his family. He grew more and more sad, and his haggard, fever-consumed face, triangular, a little bird-like, with beautiful black eyes, wasted away more every day. I just want to acknowledge that the fate of Major Kłopotowski is recorded in the was recorded in the memorial. The Alexander Guryanov, who heads the Polish research team for Memorial, managed to locate the place where Czapski goes on to wonder what became of Kłopotowski, how far he made it when he was deported. So Kłopotowski's name appears on the list of those who were executed at Kharkiv, one of the 20,000. And someone told me recently that the memorial plaque in Tver, which has recently been removed, I guess, the plaque that commemorates the victims executed there, it has become a subject of political contention and the site of protest. I don't have any source of information on that that's accurate, but I'd be interested to know.
If you could talk a little bit about all the Russian background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, ironically, one of the last pieces in this book is Czapski's reminiscences about his youth in Petersburg. As Antonia was saying, he was a cadet, and he grew up on an estate in what is now Belarus, but was sent to Petersburg for his education. And this extraordinary long interview he gave, which has been transcribed and which I translated for this book, gives his account of life in Petersburg before and immediately after the revolution, and the extraordinary experiment in Tolstoyan pacifism and what he, in retrospect, sees as a rather fanatical kind of wish to preach the gospel to anyone who would listen. He has a wonderfully ironic view of himself as a young man, and at the same time, Tolstoy remained a central figure to him throughout his life. I mean, he quotes him, and the aspect of Tolstoy which struggled with the conflicts between art and morality, I think were at the heart of a lot of Czapski's thinking, and the real difficulties in his life, including the fact that he himself was gay, and he struggled with his own sexuality, and obviously the attitudes of his society towards that. The other essays that I included in this volume include a beautiful essay about Chaim Soutine, who grew up, in a shtetl not very far from the Czapski estate in the Russian, Belarus now, Russian Empire. and a painter with whom Czapski felt an enormous sympathy and fascination, because Soutine was wild and self-destructive in a way that Czapski, I don't think, ever was, but he was attracted to artists of that kind. He also writes about, there's a beautiful essay about Alexander Blok and his sort of brief infatuation with the revolution, and his then sort of the disgust that he then came to feel for 12, his poem, The 12. There's also an excerpt from Czapski's diary about meeting Akhmatova again. So they met twice, once in the middle of the war, and that is a passage I think Antonia is going to read in a minute. She came to Paris just for a few days in 1965 and sent word to Czapski that she would like to see him. So there's a very touching description of them meeting again. She now, you know, an older woman, sort of majestical. I'm sorry, I'm not keeping track of time, so.
You can say a few more words, obviously, about the Russian culture. While you're looking, I would like to say that when I was reading the Starobil'sk memoirs, I was absolutely struck by the empathy, by the sympathy he has for the Soviet people around them. There are two incredible passages when in one he says, I had never seen in Poland such devastated and miserable villages as what I saw there in the Soviet Union. And another even more poignant, that in this horrible camp where the Poles were kept, they still were better fed than the Soviet people. I'm saying the Soviet because I don't know whether they were Russians or Ukrainians, but people from the Soviet Union who actually knew that the Poles were getting better, a little bit better. What could have been much better, it's impossible, but simply bread, which he says this country of grain production did not produce enough for its population. But to come back to the cultural figures he speaks about, maybe.
Well, what I had in mind, actually, you know, I'll read whatever you like, but one of the essays in here that I wanted to mention, which seems to me particularly relevant now, is called Nationality or Exceptionality. And it's really about the stereotypes of Russia that, you know, for obvious reasons, historical reasons, have been common in Poland and in Eastern Europe. And his own desire to sort of overcome them. And I think that was a lifelong effort for him, because, you know, it went along with his absolute respect and belief in art, but also in the individual. That is the distaste for all propaganda, generalized views of peoples, and so he's constantly defending art and the individual conscience against historical, you know, history itself, the loss and pain of history, but also the sort of facile responses to it, which perpetuate war and hostility. So I just wanted to read a little passage, if that's, if I have time, from this essay. It starts with a quote from Custine, Letters from Russia. Here to lie is to protect society, to speak the truth is to overthrow the state. So this is the last page. Can the vision of Russia as entirely cruel and criminal nowhere more widely accepted than in the countries swallowed up or subjugated by Russia or the Soviet Union. Can this vision be a surprise to Russians, even only those of the best sort, who suffer no less cruelly under the current state of affairs? The precipice opened up between Russia and those countries under her yoke, I think specifically of Poland and Hungary, is so deep that breaking the hardened stereotype in Poland, for example, seems quite impossible, if it were not for one thought, one truth more than ever self-evident, that freedom is one and that terror oppressing all is one. The workers going out into the streets of Berlin, the events in Poznan, October, the Hungarian Rising, the fierce, furious battles within communist parties of all countries, after Khrushchev's speech at the 20th Party Congress. All of these seem tragic, hopeless gestures if Russia does not join the battle, if not only Polish, German, or Hungarian workers, intellectuals, or peasants are ready to fight for the old, worn out, so often falsified and overused slogan of freedom. Russia is more cut off by the curtain of silence, quote, worse than misfortune, than it was 120 years ago when Kustin wrote those words. But we know of the Vorkuta rebellion. We know of the ferment at universities, at institutions of higher education. We know of the extremely anti-Soviet mood among the younger generation, whose political consciousness was formed during the period of the 20th Party Congress. In Resurrection, Tolstoy describes the young grass trying to grow in the spring, even between the stones of a prison. Without that hope, the hope that the will to fight has not died out in Russia, that a freer life, for which so many generations of Russians died, can be achieved there too, all attempts at liberalization would seem to be the despairing gestures of drowning men.
Oh, thank you very much. I think it's uniquely relevant to the current situation, and I hope we'll talk a little bit more about it all once we get to question and answer session. But I first wanted to ask Antonia maybe to read or to say a few words about this meeting with Akhmatova, because I very much want to read her poem in Russian.
It's best if Czapski says this himself, but as I mentioned, he met Anna Akhmatova in Kuybuyshev at the house of Alexei Tolstoy. So I had the page marked and I've lost it like an idiot. Here we are, found it. Sorry. So he describes how Akhmatova came to be tolerated in a difficult situation. So that evening, Akhmatova was sitting under a lamp, wearing a modest dress in between a sack and a light habit made of very poor material. Her slightly greying hair was smoothly combed and tied with a coloured scarf. She must once have been very beautiful, with regular features, a classic oval face, and large grey eyes. She drank wine and spoke little, in a slightly strange tone, as if half joking, even about the to recite some of her own for us. She agreed willingly. She declaimed a few passages from her as yet unpublished Leningrad poem. All those present treated her with the greatest respect, giving me to understand that she was a great Russian poet. The verses she recited in a strange sing-song tone, as another Russian poet, Igor Severyanin, used to, contained none of the optimistic propaganda or praise for the Soviet Union and Soviet heroes that even Tolstoy sank to time and again with his stern and just Soviet knights. But her Leningrad poem was the only work that moved me, and gave me a brief evocation of what the defense of the starving, devastated, heroic city must have been like. Akhmatova's poem began with memories of youth, difficult metaphors, commedia dell'arte, peacocks, violets, lovers, and a maple tree with yellow leaves in the window of the former Sheremetyev Palace, and ended with Leningrad cold and hungry under bombardment, besieged Leningrad. I never forgot the lines about the hungry little boy who, during the bombing, in early spring or late fall, brought her some travinki, blades of grass, that had grown between the cobblestones. I was eager to get to know her better, to see her on her own and go further into her world, but I didn't dare. Once already, an innocent visit that I had made to a woman without Sokolovsky as my escort, who was the KGB man who was with him, had had very tragic consequences. I have retained a memory of Akhmatova as someone special with whom contact was difficult because of a certain affectation, or perhaps she just had a more singular manner. I felt as if I were communing with a wounded person, trying to mask her wounds, defending herself without affectation. Her poem, she then recited more of them, is linked with my memories of the Russian symbolists and sometimes of Rilke. Before 1914, Akhmatova had lived in Paris, where she was a friend of Modigliani. Many of his letters and drawings, which she had kept, were destroyed during the siege of Leningrad.
And I think he says somewhere, I don't remember, yes, probably in this book, how he met her in Paris. And he asked her about her son, because he obviously had known, he obviously knew that the son had been imprisoned. And she said that their relations were not that great. The poem that Akhmatova wrote in 1959, so much later, after many years after this encounter, is about the night when they were going home. Probably Czapski was seeing her to the place where she lived. And they hardly knew each other, but still they felt some closeness, some intimacy, maybe, if I can put it like this. It's not a very long poem, but still there are 6 stanzas. So I don't know if many of you will survive the 6 stanzas of Russian, but I'll probably read it, and then we'll open it for questions. So this is from the cycle that is called Tashkent Pages. So it's a sort of a memory of this meeting. В ту ночь мы сошли друг от друга с ума, светила нам только зловещая тьма, свое бормотали арыки, и Азией пахли гвоздики. И мы проходили сквозь город чужой, сквозь дымную песнь и полуночный зной, а дни под созвездием змея, взглянуть друг на друга не смея. То мог быть Стамбул или даже Багдад, но, увы, не Варшава, не Ленинград. И горькое это несходство душило, как воздух сиротства. И чудилось, рядом шагают века, и в бубен незримая била рука, и звуки, как тайные знаки, пред нами кружились во мраке. Мы были с тобою в таинственной мгле, как будто бы шли по ничейной земле, но месяц алмазной филукой вдруг выплыл над встречей разлукой. И если вернется та ночь и к тебе, в твоей для меня непонятной судьбе, ты знай, что приснилась кому-то священная эта минута. So she calls it встреча, разлука, the meeting and separation. which obviously she remembered as well when they met in Paris. So on this beautiful note, we'll probably open it up for you to ask questions, and please, if anybody is already ready, or I can ask a question about the this terrible issue that we are seeing today, that for lots of people the renewed totalitarian character of Russia in a way annihilates the Russian culture. And I just wanted to ask what you would like to say to that, and because there are different points of view, because, well, I personally think that the Russian culture is the only thing that opposed totalitarianism all through centuries. But for lots of people, and as a friend of mine said, with some justification, Russian culture is unthinkable without totalitarianism. So we are probably between these two extremes of approach, and Czapski is very much the figure that has known Russian totalitarianism as much as anybody, and he still was an admirer of the Russian culture. So do you think, what do you think, where do we place him, and how it works with today's situation?
It seems to me that one of the things that we can learn from Czapski, and not just in the context of Eastern Europe and current events, but on a larger scale, is that what he acknowledges, what he assumes, is that all culture has in it these contradictions. That is, all civilizations have tendencies towards unfreedom and tendencies towards freedom, tendencies to build and tendencies to destroy, and that he sees them in Polish culture too. That is, we are all in the same boat, and that seems to me that what I take from all of his writing, that he had a special love for Russia because he essentially grew up with it. I also think that he was deeply attracted to the Orthodox tradition and the icon tradition. That is the sort of the religious tradition within which looking has a metaphysical dimension. So that, I think that for him as an artist was important. But I find it, I don't know about Antonia, or anyone here, but I find it maddening to be having these conversations now, because it just seems to me so obvious that I mean, yes, it's horrible to see Russia politically regressing in this way, but it seems to be in the nature of human civilization that we progress and we regress, and the question is how we, help across borders, help one another progress.
Thank you, Antonia. To you.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, I was trying to imagine the other day, because, of course, we're all aware of Ukrainian friends having just a total, at the moment, loathing of anything Russian and not wanting anything to do with it. I was trying to imagine what it must have felt like during the Second World War, how we would feel about German culture. And my father, who was in the army during the Second World War, he used to joke and say, the only good German is a dead German. Beethoven, even Beethoven isn't good enough, so on. And I just don't know how that feels to have people flinging missiles at you. And so, I mean, thankfully for me, but I do have some, I can kind of understand why the Ukrainians respond like that. But I also think it's totally counterproductive. And the rest of us who aren't living in the middle of the war, should do what we can to protect and encourage the beneficial Russian culture, because I don't believe that Russian culture is purely kind of dominated by the fact that it's always been a totalitarian country. That's rubbish. And also there are an awful lot of great Russian artists, writers, playwrights, etc., who are now in exile in Finland, in Armenia and Georgia, and the few countries that will let them in without a visa. They're desperate, they're running out of money, they've got nowhere to go. They're just as traumatized as the Ukrainian refugees, and these are people who should be having a voice, because if anything's going to change in Russia, we need these people who think differently, and I think we need to listen to that contemporary culture, and obviously not the manipulated version. But no, I think we should be being open and using that for the benefit of the situation, to try and help the situation.
Thank you very much. Well, if anybody would like to say something, please. Yes. Wait a minute. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
So my question was, you mentioned that Czapski was quite kind towards his friends and strangers. I would love to hear anything more if you have some stories. Or
I can't think of any anecdotes off the top of my head, but he was extremely modest, and as I said, he lived in this tiny little room. He wasn't really interested in wealth or fame or anything. He was a very generous person who would give away his last penny. But of course he also didn't write about that because he wasn't going to start blowing his own trumpet. But it's very evident if you read Inhuman Land how he was constantly looking out for other people and protecting other people, and he was interested in absolutely everybody. Like Alissa was saying, it wasn't, he didn't separate people by class at all. He didn't have much class awareness, and he was just genuinely wanted to know about everyone. And it comes across very strongly that he's just constantly supporting other people and listening to them and trying to help them. But at the same time, he doesn't kind of document his own saintliness in an obvious way because he was genuinely saintly. So I would recommend reading these books, and you'll see endless examples of his kindness, just reading between the lines.
Thank you.
Just a brief... There's a wonderful Polish writer, Miron Białaszewski, who was one of the many younger, all the Poles, the young Poles who managed to get out for a little trip, like Herbert and, members of this younger generation made sort of pilgrimages to the Kultura headquarters in Maison Lafitte outside Paris, where Czapski had his single room studio living space. And Czapski sort of would take them under his wing, would show them around Paris and, cultivate them in a way that I think among artists is very rare. That is, I think in some sense as an artist, he suffered from not having enough ego. He gave himself away. And this comes back in a lot of memories that people have of him. I mean, I've met many people, and I'm sure Antonia has, who had the chance to visit Czapski and were sort of enveloped in this extraordinary attention, which strengthened, nourished, whole generations of artists and writers. And he went out of his way to make connections between people, to introduce, an artist to a gallery, to do this kind of work of culture, which did not serve him as an artist at all. So that's one way in which this manifested itself.
Yes, Joseph.
Yes, I mean, I think just a comment also on the Russian culture. It's very typical on the one hand, the aggressive side of it, or the aggressive side of Russia has co-opted so much culture that was actually directed against previous iterations of the totalitarianism. You know, Solzhenitsyn is on the school syllabus. As far as I know, he hasn't been thrown out. So, you know, the person who was the arch enemy of the Soviet regime, and then on the other hand, you have people nowadays who are against it, who are actively putting their voice against totalitarian tendencies, and they will probably be co-opted by the next wave. So it seems to be that way always works. But what really, the question really that I have for you, it seems astonishing because on the one hand, Czapski himself was a victim of Soviet, i.e. Russian-dominated aggression, I mean, quite literally. And then on the other hand, he talks about starving Leningrad and you know, that same country that tortured him, that same government that tortured him, now was being tortured by the common enemy, the Germans, who'd also done very well.
He was a human being, not a nationalist.
Hmm?
He was a human being rather than a nationalist.
Right, yes. But it's I mean, a lot of the Ukrainians who now say, "Хочу задушить пару русских," they are not nationalists either. They're human beings, and they react in that way. So it's fascinating to see those, you know, somebody right in the middle of it.
It's worth mentioning that, you know, Czapski, you know, remained faithful to he had a tremendous memory for poetry, and, you know, he loved reciting he had, you know, reams and reams of poetry by heart in Russian, in Polish, in French, but also in German. I mean, some of the poets who were most dear to him were German. So that's just another example of, he simply did not, you know, yes, he fought the Nazis. He didn't fight the Germans.
Yes, Julia.
Thank you. Antonia, you mentioned that when he was a young man growing up, that he had quite sort of revolutionary ideas almost. And then when he was in St. Petersburg and refused to fight, and he saw the horrible suppression of the February Revolution. So I wonder whether at that stage or some earlier stage, whether he had sympathy for the Bolshevik Revolution, and whether that's just something that he then saw through, or whether he was never really impressed with that.
Elissa may know. I don't think he had any sympathy with the Bolshevik Revolution. No, I think what he had, and particularly had no sympathy with violence and oppression. So I don't think it was to his taste at all. And of course, he saw through it pretty quickly. He wasn't. No, I don't think he ever showed any sympathy for it.
There's a passage in his reminiscences about Petersburg, revolutionary Petersburg, where he's walking down the street. This is before the Bolshevik Revolution. This was, you know, at the time when there were spontaneous, you know, demonstrations of, and you know, people marching with banners for free love and so on. And he describes the sort of incredible radiance in people's faces. And so he was very, very moved, I think, by the popular revolution. And then, you know, as many people did, saw the Bolshevik takeover as a tragic sequel to that.
Alissa, there's a woman he mentions in both books who was a Soviet official who he went to see on a much earlier mission where he was trying to find some other missing people. And this woman was some sort of ministry official. Do you remember that? And she was a Bolshevik, and yes, that's it. And he was very impressed by her and liked her very much, but she told him absolute rubbish and misled him and told him things that he didn't believe or agree with, but he still had very great sympathy towards her. So he was always seeing people on the human level. This was this unsullied view of humanity where he didn't judge people according to their ideologies particularly. He saw people on a much more human level.
It should also be said that he did end up fighting. I can't remember what you may have said about this, but after his pacifist, sort of his refusal to fight in the First World War, he decided to fight for Polish independence against the Bolsheviks. So he ended up, you know, yes, in 1919, 1920, fighting in that war and distinguishing himself, in fact. I mean, he won a medal, which he treated with great disdain, but still, there were things that he was prepared to fight for. So that's also another aspect of him. You know, he wasn't. I think one of the interesting things about him was that he was constantly revising himself, which is why the diary form suited him so well. I mean, his whole life, he was constantly fine-tuning what he thought of himself, what he thought of his own experience, and reassessing, so that the diaries, when they're finally available, will be the most complete Czapski. You know, things like the revolution, events in history, he returns to again and again, and you know, with revisions and new ideas. And I think that's what kept him young and kept him going for so long, that he was constantly absorbing new information and integrating it on the deepest level with what he knew of the world.
I wanted to pick, yes, okay, you wanted to respond, yes, please, and then, yeah, okay, let me pick up from what Jozef said, and then I'll pass the mic to you. I mean, just about Czapski being the victim of the Soviet Union, obviously, and still he's trying to be fair, and this is where I'll tell you about his influence on Animal Farm, because when Orwell and Czapski met in Paris, which was some time between February and March 1945, Czapski said something that impressed Orwell very much. He said, you know why they did not let Moscow pass into the Nazis' hands? Because Stalin stayed there. Whether it's true or not, it's anybody's guess. I personally am not sure, but it impressed Orwell to an extent that he wrote a letter to his publisher because he was hoping that maybe Animal Farm was already being printed. It wasn't yet, but another 5 months had to pass. But he said, I would like you to make one change. In chapter 7, I write about the reaction of the animals to the explosion, because the mill that they had been building was exploded by human beings, by people, and that it was a terrifying noise and everybody was scared, and all the animals fell down on their faces just there, and he had it written in the original version, including Napoleon, who stands for Stalin, obviously. But after this conversation with Czapski, he changed this word including, he replaced it with except Napoleon. So he wanted to give even Stalin his due, and that came from Czapski. So they both were trying to be extremely fair, and also, of course, when you were saying that some of you, or both of you, were speaking about Czapski's humanism as opposed to ideological approach. This is also very typical of Orwell, who actually wrote to say that once you meet, I try to write my articles without meeting people, because once you meet somebody, you understand that it's a human and not just an ideological construct. So this maybe was something that they appreciated in each other, if they could come to that in this very, very short lunch. Julia, I'm giving you the microphone again.
Thank you. This is actually a question for you, Masha. I was just wondering whether any of Czapski's work has been translated into Russian, and is he known in Russia at all?
Right. I don't know to what extent he's known, but I sort of expected this question. And here is the book. It is quite big, and it has both Starobil'sk and Inhuman Land. It was published, this particular edition, I don't know if there was any other, but this particular edition was printed in 2012, and I think it was funded by the Poles. So there is a sign of Polska, Polsza, so I think they probably gave the money. I don't think that the print run was very big, but nowadays in Russia there are no big, nowadays we don't know, but in terms of how it has been the last 10, 15 years, the print runs, 1,000 was good, 3,000 copies for the country of 140 million was considered a lot. 5,000 was an amazing print run. It's completely incomparable with what it was in the Soviet days, of course. I looked up the translation only of Starobil'sk, and I must say that I like Alissa's translation into English better. It's much more poetic, but this is not a bad translation. This is, I can give you. I didn't know the names of these women. Any other questions, please? Yes.
Yes, I was wondering whether maybe Elisa, I don't know, but also Antonia, could say something about his general political outlook, because I mean we've talked about him, being influenced by pacifism and him being, not an anti-nationalist, which is obviously true, but he was one of the founders of Kultura, was he not? And he lived with Giedroyć, and he lived in the house there all his life. And when you think of Giedroyć's ideas, for an idea of a sort of United States of Europe, or to put it in very general terms, anti-nationalist in that sense, but the sort of idea of a European Union in the East, which to a certain extent came out of Pilsudski's idea, rather than the Dąbrowski idea of a Catholic national Poland. The idea of a multinational state with centres in Vilna, Lvov, and Minsk. So I just wondered, to what extent, whether it comes out in any of these essays that you've read, what his view of, the politics of Europe.
Well, I think as with many collaborators of Kultura, I mean, Giedroyć had his own vision, and I don't think Czapski really shared that vision, and I don't think he was even that interested in political, projections on that level. I mean, I think of Czapski as a classic liberal. I think that's where he ends up, and he's he's liberal to his bones in the sense that he's constantly questioning himself, constantly questioning whether the political ideas that exist, that are available, will serve, in this situation or that situation. That is, he's very hostile to general, to systematic thinking of any kind, and in politics all the more so. So I think his politics were directed against injustice, against lies, but they were not, he didn't have that kind of political imagination. I simply don't think he was interested. So he was immune to ideology, and I think his problem with Giedroyć would have been that, he didn't think that one kind of systematic project politically could be replaced by another. So, you know, that's the paradox of liberalism. That is, it often, you know, the impulse is towards criticizing shortcomings, but the priority is, and I think for Czapski was always to preserve the freedom of the individual. And I think he did that on many different levels. I mean, there's also interesting writing that he did on a visit to America. He's a very interesting observer of American life, because he went to America to raise funds for Polish students in exile. And so he was going around giving lectures on Stalinist, you know, on the Soviet Union, on Stalin. But he was also, you know, like there's an essay where he's in Chicago and he meets this young Polish, you know, son of a Polish immigrant who takes him to the slaughterhouses, to the stockyards of Chicago, and he goes in and he sees, you know, a lot of the workers are black, and you know he was an observer of social injustice, you know, in that situation too. So he also didn't idealize the American system. I think in some ways he was a very, you know, his aristocratic background comes out in his politics. That is, he would like to be above politics. But he's not defending any sort of aristocratic world either, or at all nostalgic for it.
I think Elissa said it all. My only comment would be that he wasn't a political activist. He was a cultural activist, perhaps he could be defined as, but he didn't have a political agenda in that way.